Institutions dealing with the aged, the mentally retarded, and the mentally disturbed also have shown interest in scientific ways to promote tractability in their subjects. The British neurosurgeon Geoffrey Knight has reported that he first was inspired to perform lobotomies after reading about the increased admission rates of old people to state hospitals. He has performed more than 1,000 of these operations. However, for the institutionalized, aged, the retarded, and the disturbed, the primary pacifier of choice is the tranquilizer. At congressional hearings, an official of the National Council of Senior Citizens protested the abuse of tranquilizer drugs in nursing homes. He charged that there was a growing tendency to give patients ever larger doses of tranquilizers for the sole purpose of keeping them quiet and easy to manage. There are excellent reasons to prescribe tranquilizers for some people in nursing homes, but tranquilizers have a definite economic attraction to those nursing home managers concerned with profits. And the effects of the pills can deprive the older patient of interesting life experiences. This is especially true when the patients are kept so doped up they lie around in bed most of the day. The director of the National Council of Senior Citizens pointed out, if you are running a nursing home for profit and you've got tranquilized patient body, then the chances are you can save money on staff and food by keeping these poor people like zombies. More recently, in August 1975, Senate hearings were held on the operation of institutions for mentally retarded. The chairman, Senator Birch Bayh, said he was dismayed by the testimony on drugging patients. On witness, James Clements, the director of Georgia Retardation Center and pediatrician, charged that drugging retarded patients in order to subdue behavior was the rule, not the exception. He added that the behavior being subdued resulted from the environment of a typical institution for retardees. Untrained ward attendants, often with a ninth grade education, hand out drugs merely to stop behavior they don't like. At some institutions, more than 3/4 of the retardees are kept on drugs. Senator Bayh said it sounded to him like chemical handcuffing. There have also been charges that tranquilizers are abused in hospitals for the mentally ill. Again, it is alleged that the primary aim is to subdue problem patients that annoy staff members. Such use of drugs can actually prevent the patient from undergoing life experiences necessary for him to learn again to cope with society. Taming unruly public school children chemically. The uproar began in Omaha. Thousands of children in the public schools were reportedly being drugged during school hours to reduce their unruliness. It was for the children's own good, so the argument went, since they had some sort of brain malfunction, the pills helped quiet their brains so they could better students in the early grades, and they would stop disrupting the work of other students. There were also reports that in many school systems, the proportion of pupils on stimulant drugs ran between 10 to 15%. The most comprehensive study of school practices regarding pill taking in the schools at this writing was made in the Grand Rapids Public School System. The investigators were sociologist Stanley S. Robin and an educational researcher, James Bosco, both of Western Michigan University. They randomly sampled 150 teachers. 65% of the teachers knew of pupils in Ritalin. 40% of the teachers reported that they recommended consultation with a physician when a child appeared to be hyperactive. A few teachers had suggested Ritalin by name. Later, Bosco spoke more broadly about the national scene at a meeting of the National School Boards Association in Houston in 1974. He said, stimulants and other drugs are currently a fact of life in the management of hyperkinetic children in classrooms. Note the familiar word management. Officially, school personnel are only being helpful when they suggest to parents that their children might go to a doctor to see if they might benefit from stimulant drugs. But in some cases, there appears to have been a clear element of coercion, threats to hold back a child or put him in a class with a disabled label. In my conversations with physicians, He says the charge of inappropriate teacher demands that the child be placed on stimulants is not unusual. Many family doctors or pediatricians tend to accept the teacher's judgment and after a cursory examination prescribe stimulant drugs on a trial basis. Perhaps for good reason, the medical experts themselves are pretty hazy about how to diagnose a medical condition of hyperkinetic syndrome or minimal brain dysfunction or hyperactivity beyond alleged symptoms like restlessness and short attention span. Not two children seem to have the same set of symptoms. A 1975 report from psychiatrists at the University of Auckland, New Zealand found that in only 3 out of 12 tested, stimulant drugs do better than placebos in enhancing mental function of hyperactive children. When the dosages were strong, mental functioning was worse with the placebos. It might also be argued that the use of stimulant drugs defeats some major goal of good education to help children become more adept at self-control. If drugs are controlling their dispositions for them, they may grow in adolescence deficient in this crucial human skill. We have noted in this chapter a variety of scientific techniques that are being developed in a variety of situations to make people less unruly. They include cutting it into the brain, a number of drugs, and operant conditioning, both harsh and benign, all have in common a manipulative approach to people's behavior. The professed goal in each instance is to help the individual, but I think we have seen convincing evidence that easier manageability is a primary consideration in the back of the minds of most of the advocates, whether they are wardens, nurses, attendants, or teachers. It is time to make searching studies of the motives of all people and institutions fascinated with the new techniques that have as a major effect a heightening of tractability. Until such studies have been made, we should bear in mind the caution of neuropsychologist Elliot S. Wallenstein. We would be in serious trouble if a number of influential people became convinced that violence is mainly a product of a diseased brain, but rather than a diseased society. Chapter 7, Building Brighter or Duller People. It is my judgment that within 5 to 10 years, there will be available a regimen combining psychological and chemical measures that will significantly increase the intelligence of man. This troubles me and should trouble you. David Craik, a leading authority on learning. Craik made that statement in 1968. His forecast is coming true. Some scientists are predicting that IQs can be raised on the average by 20 points, and Craik is still troubled. Modifying the intelligence of individual humans is now clearly possible. This can prove to be a momentous turn in human events. Modifying the capacity for specific skills also seems possible. The ironic aspect of this impending capability is that brain scientists still have only the dimmest notions about how the brain produces intelligent actions. A student of the brain, Shinsu Nakajima, put it this way: intelligence was a miracle, then it was a mystery. When scientists believed to have grasped it, it became a mirage. Some suggest that man will never know in any detail how and where his brain stores away particular bits of information and use that information many years later to solve a problem. A man-made computer can take information that man programs into it on standardized forms. Later, when it is activated by man, it can produce a printout that repeats or uses information. But man's own brain does not acquire information in any such straightforward, systematic way. It comes by way of smell, sight, sound, taste, and touch. Each person's life involves tens of thousands of unique experiences, and each person is subjected to millions of sensory impressions that aren't programmable on tape. A breeze blowing or a rooster crowing before dawn. I could demonstrate to readers the incredible wonder of their own minds just by mentioning one word. Get ready. If you wish, get a pad and pencil to make a printout. The word is Watergate. Out should tumble hundreds of facts on reflection about cast of characters and host of issues. Your brain has registered somewhere the gurgling sound of Senator Sam Ervin's voice. It has stored the image of Rosemary Wood, President Nixon's secretary, straining to demonstrate how she answered a telephone while transcribing a tape recorder. Your mind has preserved the novel use of words by the White House group in such comments as, let's stonewall it, or that's particular time frame. You pick these impressions up over a period of 2 years. At the start, the word Watergate meant nothing to you. Certainly, your brain has no single compartment that eventually became labeled Watergate. It doesn't even have an ongoing compartment labeled National Affairs, subsection Shenanigans. For the most part, things we learn through our eyes and things we learn through our ears probably get stored in different areas, but that doesn't explain much. A particular memory apparently may be stored in a variety of areas, and it seems to move around. It may be in part of the brain one day, but doesn't seem to be there a few days later. If the person has a brain abnormality, the memory seems more likely to stay in one area. The brain explorer Wilder Penfield of the Montreal Neurological Institute was electrically probing the brain of a woman suffering from epilepsy. He found that whenever he stimulated one particular area, the woman heard a certain tune. We start with the ancestral knowledge built into our genes at birth. All that comes after is learned knowledge and acquired intelligence. Developing these involves 5 distinct processes. 1, the acquisition phase. This is pure initial learning. Sensory experiences are converted into neural impulses. 2, temporary unstable coding of what has just been acquired and considered to be worth storing. The names of many people we meet at parties escape within 10 seconds or less. 3, the permanent coding and filing away of what was learned. They may occur as separate processes in subsequent hours. 4, the systematic recall, memory, days or years later, of what was learned. 5, the evaluation of many recalled facts, often seemingly unrelated, in order to come up with a decision. This is called thinking, the most baffling of all to comprehend as a physiological process. How all these 5 things happen is still just guessed at. Scientists call a stored bit of knowledge an engram, E-N-G-R-A-M, engram, but they aren't sure what an engram is. At first, they thought it was a new pathway or trace in the brain's nerve network. Now there is frequent mention of it as a coded chemical. They have learned enough about brain function, though, to venture guesses about the kinds of substances that are deeply implicated in acquiring intelligence and knowledge. Their focus is on transmitters of nerve impulses, especially the transmitter acetylcholine. Its efficiency appears to affect stage number 1 of the learning process. An ideal amount of acetylcholine seems to promote swift learning, at least as important as ribonucleic acid, RNA, which is now believed to be crucial in fixing what is learned up into permanent memory. RNA molecules are critical components of all living matter. For example, they synthesize a great variety of protein inside cells. Coded protein molecules may well be the building blocks of memory. The first evidence that RNA was deeply involved in memory came in the 1950s from a Swedish neurobiologist at the University of Göteborg, Holger Heiden. We had performed the remarkable feat of isolating and analyzing single living brain cells. The brains belonged to rats. He put rats through a rigorous mental regime before they could obtain food. For example, he forced them to learn to walk a tight wire. He noticed that the brain cells of rats that had been forced to learn in order to get food showed an abnormally high RNA content. Brain power through exercise. A few years earlier, a group of at the University of California, Berkeley, had discovered that mind stretching seemed to build better minds. And this group eventually discovered a great deal more about enhancing brain function. The central figure was David Craik, a witty scientist who, until his recent death, cruised the hills of Berkeley in a Citroen. Craik first aroused my interest after World War II when it was disclosed that he had helped run a super secret training and screening program for the would-be United States spies. Some were European refugees. All were stripped of identity. They were subjected to fiendish psychological and physical stresses, and at the end, they were required to develop cover stories that would withstand Craik's ingenious slashing interrogation. After government service, Craik went to Berkeley. Although he was at the time a social psychologist, he found himself again pondering the mystery of the brain. Early in his career, he had apprenticed himself to the noted neurophysiologist Carl Lashley. Craik was well aware of the conventional wisdom that heredity shaped the brain. The brain was supposed to be fixed in size and performance, and that was that. It seemed logical to Craik, however, that there ought to be biochemical differences between the brains of bright people and those of dumb people. Change the chemistry of the brain, and maybe you can change its brightness. He didn't know enough about chemistry to test such a presumptive notion, but he was persuasive in winning support to put together a team of experts. He recruited, among others, Edward Bennett, a biochemist, Margaret Rosenwig, a biological psychologist, and later Marian Diamond, a neuroanatomist. What would be the best way to test his concept? All agreed they should focus on acetylcholine because of its crucial role in transmitting information-bearing impulses. They guessed that a busy, lively brain would have to be unusually well endowed with it. But an obstacle loomed. You can't measure acetylcholine in an autopsy. It breaks down swiftly after use or death. The group finally decided that acetylcholine might be measured indirectly. The enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine persists and can be weighed. If the amount of acetylcholine varies, the enzyme should vary proportionately. So they went after that enzyme in the brains of decapitated rats that were known to be very bright or very dumb. There was the evidence. The brains of the bright rats did have more of the enzyme than the brains of the dumb rats. Then the Craik group, being unconventional, proposed that they turn the proposition around. If a brain with superior chemistry is better at learning, then would a lot of exposure to learning produce superior chemistry in the brain? So they started sending a group of young rats to school in Berkeley. Each trial course lasted 90 days. A control group of other young rats continued to live normal lives, and a third group of rats was put into solitary confinement in a dark, noiseless area. The enriched environment of the young rats that went to school was a delight. They had big cages with lots of companions. Playthings were changed every day. There were spinning wheels, which young rats enjoy mastering. There were trapezes, slides, you name it. But it wasn't all play. Day after day, there were tests to take. The rats confronted maze problems with rewards of sugar waiting at the end of the maze. They faced real brain twisting discrimination problems. They had to decide which of two alleys, one lighted, one darkened, to go up in order to reach food. Once they learned the solution, Craik's group would make a systematic switch and watch how long it took each rat to unlearn the old habit and learn the new. And then again and again, the correct alley would be switched, but each time in the same pattern of change. Craik explained to me, a real bright rat will catch the patterns of change and stop bumping his nose within a minimum of errors. A dull rat will find each change a brand new problem. After 90 days, the rats of all three groups were decapitated and their brains immediately dissected. Meanwhile, new groups of young rats were put into the three environments. The evidence mounted in the young rats who were sent to school in the enriched environment had more of the enzyme associated with acetylcholine than the rats in the normal environment. And those in solitary confinement had less. The big surprise, however, was the changes that Miriam Diamond, the neuroanatomist, began noticing. The rats from the enriched environments had developed greater thickness in the cortex layer, the main thinking part of the brain. The cortex covers the cerebrum. Even the brain cells of the rats who had gone to school had become larger. Learning tests made before they were all decapitated to show that the school rats became brighter than those left in ordinary or deprived environments. This was the first time anyone had proved that lasting changes occur in the brain as a result of experience. Crick sighed. Thousands of rats gave their all for us to prove this point. Since then, many tests have confirmed the above findings, not only with rats, but with kittens and dogs. Crick added that while the enriched environment works best with young animals, some changes in intelligence can be made in adults by a dramatic increase of enrichment in the environment. No one has yet put a substantial group of humans through a rugged learning regime and then decapitated them to check their enzymes or cortex thickness. It is probably not necessary. There is now mounting evidence that an enriched environment does accelerate human learning ability. For example, there is the evidence of a worldwide Montessori movement. Maria Montessori took poor children from a big public school housing development in Rome and immersed them in a school setting rich in colorful sensory stimulation. There was a great variety of interesting puzzles and objects to work with and to manipulate. They were reading eagerly by 3 or 4, and by 5 or 6, they were deep in geometry. Study of Community of Children in Jamaica by a group headed by Stephen Richardson also supports the critical role of stimulating environment. Crick believed that most important element for creating an enriched environment for humans is not mazes or colorful stimulation, but language. Man is a language animal. Early immersion in talking, reading, and writing, he deduces, should improve brain power. The neurophysiologist Robert S. Morrison has stated in Science that young children who have books at home learn to read earlier than those who don't have these amenities. Some investigators thought that if an enriched environment really produced more efficiency brains, then the evidence should show up in graduates of Head Start program. This program of federal government has involved about 350,000 preschool children from the ghetto. It was supposed to broaden their horizons, improve their nutrition, and generally get them off to a better start in life. Early evaluations showed that as measured by school test scores, Head Start children get off to a better start in school, but that advantage often persisted for only a year or so. The brains of many Head Start children, it should be pointed out, had probably been stunted by malnutrition before or after birth. Also, the program did not put much emphasis on brain stretching exercises or languages or enriching the home environment. A better test of the enrichment concept may come out of the Early Education Project in Brookline, Massachusetts. Within 2 years, there will be at least 100 youngsters ready for school who have been in that program. Since infancy, they have been provided with an enriched environment largely as a result of counseling with parents. The program sponsors believe that the first 3 years of life are the most important years in which to make an impact on later intelligence. When Crick and his colleagues found that they could produce both brain changes and learning ability by enriching the environment, they asked the next logical question. As Crick put it, we said, well, now let's see if we can find a drug that will do the same thing to the brain that he and the enriched environment will do. One of the Crick student researchers, James McGaw, now a psychologist and university administrator, was the first to come up with such a drug. It was, of all things, strychnine, a deadly poison. One clue that led McGaw on his colleague, Louis Petronovich, to try it was the fact that decades ago, a very mild form of strychnine had been an ingredient in spring tonic used to pep up youngsters after the winter. Also, a search of literature showed that early in the 20th century, Craig's mentor, Carl Lashley, had listed strychnine as somehow making rats more eager learners. In mild form, it apparently stimulates the nervous system to greater activity. At any rate, it made star pupils of McGaw and Petronovich's rats. It could be administered before tests for brightness or up to an hour after the tests. But the sooner it was administered after a test, the better it worked. That suggests that a part of its stimulating effect is to improve memory fixing. Later, after he became a full-fledged scientist, McGaw and his colleagues discovered still other brain stimulants. All would be highly dangerous in large doses. There were nicotine, caffeine, amphetamine, and picrotoxin, a poison resembling strychnine. The best seemed to be a convulsant called metrazole, sometimes used by doctors in shock therapy. McGaw and Petronovich tested metrazole on genetically identical rats. Some got it, some did not. The ones that got it could learn a maze in 5 attempts on the average. Those that did not get it needed 20 attempts. More recently, getting closer to man, metrazole has been tried on rhesus monkeys at the Wisconsin Regional Primate Center. Results were remarkably similar. Monkeys solved a problem in 1/4 of the time it took monkeys without metrazole. A totally different chemical approach to enhancing memory has been taken by the Dutch pharmacology researcher David de Wide of the University of Utrecht. He has reported finding very significant improvements in the memories of rats after they have been injected with the synthetic form of peptide. This peptide is found in the tiny pituitary gland, sometimes called the master gland, at the base of the brain. Since it is product found naturally in the human body, should not offer the toxic hazard that the long time use of stimulants like strychnine might entail. It is being tested on humans. In 1975, DeWide announced findings that still another substance stored in the pituitary gland, the hormone vasopressin, had even more dramatic effect in enhancing memory of animals. Several pharmaceutical companies are currently in a race to develop a safe memory enhancing drug. Drugs that show promise of helping aged people retain their mental facilities involving memory are moving into the experimental stage. The still controversial non-chemical approach to giving the baby's brain a head start is the decompression chamber. Joshua Lederberg, the geneticist, has pointed out that the shape of the human female pelvis has through the ages put a limit on the size of the infant skull. This in turn has put a limit on the size of the human brain cavity. If cesarean delivery became routine, the brain might in time grow larger. And perhaps the process could be speeded up by growth hormones. Another Nobelist, the French biologist Jean Rostand, has pointed out that a way that human brain might be doubled in size fairly rapidly. It is based on evidence that prenatal growth in human brain occurs as a result of a fixed number of cell divisions, or doublings. There are ways to speed up or slow down cell division. Rostand suggested that scientists might seek to develop a drug that would stimulate only the brain. The brain cells might then undergo an extra division or doubling before birth. But is bigness in brains necessarily betterness? Up to a certain point in human evolution, brain size was critical. However, many modern geniuses, among them Anatole France, have had smaller cranial capacity than the average Neanderthal man. Apparently, when it comes to brilliance, the quality of the brain counts the most. Lots of the forebrain, a thick, highly wrinkled cortex or covering on the cerebrum, an above average ratio of working nerve cells to the jelly-like glial cells surrounding the nerve cells, lots of impulse transmitter material, and perhaps most important, above average intricacy of the network of interconnections between nerve cells. Possibly by experimentation, man could achieve selective growth within the brain. And you might have something really starting to reckon with. It has been achieved in rats. A group headed by the biochemist Steven Zamenhof at the University of California, Los Angeles, injected pregnant rats with growth hormones. The brains of the offspring weighed a third more than normal. More to the point, most of the growth was in the thinking part of the brain. There were more nerve cells in the cortex to every 100 glial cells. Glial derives from the Greek word for glue, but recent evidence suggests that glial cells are not just packing material, but may be involved in intellectual work. As the rats grew, there was an unusually intricate proliferation of interconnections among cells, and most noteworthy, the big-brained experimental rats actually were brighter on standardized maze test. A group that included McGaw at the University of California, Irvine, found in 2 tests that mild electric stimulation of an area of the hippocampus of rats facilitated learning. The hippocampus is suspected of being somehow involved with memory processing. It was surmised that the electric stimulation accelerated the process of memory storage. Carl Pribben, brain physiologist at Stanford, has stated, "I certainly could educate a child by putting an electrode in the lateral hypothalamus and then selecting the situations at which I stimulate it. In this way, I can grossly change his behavior." He was just making a point and insisted that he would not do such a thing as a matter of ethics. A number of researchers have produced that they thought were improvements in the speed of learning simply by passing a low frequency current between plates placed on each side of the head. This has been tried in both monkeys and man. Meanwhile, a search is on to find some simple electrical way to measure a youngster's IQ. Consider how much time and bother could be saved at schools and colleges. A college applicant could be put on the doubtful list just by tracing made by a brainwave machine. A Czech psychologist has been testing the possibility that intelligence can be measured by the ratio of theta to alpha waves, and a Canadian psychologist is trying to prove that his electrical machine measures the speed of mental reactions, crucial to intelligence. The test involves tracking the speed with which the brain responds to flashes of light. Such taps on the brain might eventually tell something, perhaps offer a crude, culture-free measure of the potential for fast mental activity and hence become popular with schools. But they probably would have little to say about the person's persistence, imagination, integrity, creativity, sanity, or potential for accurate thinking. Transplanting or manufacturing memories. James V. McConnell, a colorful psychologist from the University of Michigan, came up with some discoveries about memory that seemed simply unbelievable. Some of his fellow scientists were at first aghast. Memories reported were not necessarily personal. they could be transferred to other individuals, at least in the animal world. Some thought that this preposterous talk would give a science a bad name. And memory can indeed be transferred. The finding will stand as one of the most astonishing discoveries of modern neurobiology. It will certainly support the concept that memory has a molecular basis. The McConnell started with only a skimpy knowledge of biology, but he had an enormous curiosity about behavior, and he got expert instruction on physiology while still a graduate student at the University of Texas. This came from his many sources, including his friend Robert Thompson, a physiological psychologist. Memory molecules, McConnell told me, float around anywhere and can theoretically wind up in a big toe. But you can't get any response from such a molecule until it gets back to the brain in humans. Its chemicals will mean something only to brain cells. By floating around anywhere, he meant within the body's nervous system. He now believes that the central nervous system has few sites where learning is converted into memory molecules. Quite probably, these molecules get pumped out into appropriate areas of the brain during dream sleep. The professor in charge of the animal laboratory at the University of Texas was scornful of McConnell's proposals for studying memory. He was so scornful, in fact, that he refused McConnell and Thompson lab space. They therefore began their now historic experiments in McConnell's kitchen. They decided to start with the simplest creature that could be considered to have a brain, and the inch-long flatworm. Its brain is a network of about 400 cells. They set up a water tank with electrodes at each end. As expected, they found that when they sent a very mild shock through the tank, the worms would scrunch up. So then they began to turn on a light 2 seconds before the shock. At first, the worms ignored the light. In fact, it tended to relax them. But soon they began scrunching up the instant the light went on. Just as Pavlov's dogs had salivated when the bell rang, the worms were capable of learning and remembering. Later, when he was a psychologist at the University of Michigan, McConnell pushed on the boulder worm experiments. After educating worms to scrunch on the light cue, he cut them in half. It seems that flatworms can be cut in half, and in a few weeks, each half will grow a new head or tail. The tails that grew back into worms had brains, and the brains had the old memories. This astonished even McConnell. It turned out that the educated tail-based worms remember the light cue even better than educated worms that had not been cut at all. In worms, at least, it seems that memories are stored all over the body, not just in the brain. He cut worms up into many as 5 pieces, and all the pieces regenerated brains that remembered. McConnell had also learned that his worms were cannibalistic, and that gave him another bold idea. After conditioning worms to scrunch when a light went on, he chopped them up and fed them to hungry, untrained cannibal worms. He says that after letting the cannibals have a day or two to digest their meals, we then gave them their first exposure to light shock training. To our delight, the cannibals that ate educated victims showed much faster learning to scrunch at the signal of light than did cannibals that ate uneducated or untrained victims. Well, all this was pretty unsettling to a skeptical scientific community. Psychologists began jokingly to envision the day when students would learn their lessons by eating their professors. A large number of laboratories tried testing the transferability of memory, not only on worms, but on chicks, goldfish, mice, rats, and hamsters. By 1973, at least 22 different laboratories had published positive findings of memory transfer with vertebrates alone. A substantial number of other investigations reported that they had been unsuccessful, Unfortunately for skeptics, the possibility of memory transfer seemed so highly unlikely that positive reports seemed much more impressive than negative reports. One group of researchers who perhaps trying to blow McConnell out of the water for good wrote a letter to Science saying that each of them in separate studies had found no support for memory transfer. While the letter was going to press, one investigator who had signed the letter came up with positive results. He recanted and became a believer. Meanwhile, several of the positive finders came up with something else that outraged those with conventional wisdom. They could transfer memory across species barriers of rats or mice that had been educated to shun darkness, which they normally prefer, were made into a soup and injected into hamsters. The injected hamsters soon began shunning darkness. It also worked vice versa. One of the cross-species pioneers, neurochemist Georges Ungar, quite recently reported that with coded molecules, he had isolated the specific substance in the brain of a rat that caused a conditioned rat to avoid darkness. He called it scotobia, scotophobin, Greek for darkness sphere. The brain of 4,000 conditioned rats were pooled to obtain a sample large enough to permit the isolation of this substance. The material turned out to be a peptide with a complex amino acid sequence. Peptides are molecules formed by two or more amino acids. It has since been synthesized. Efforts to replicate the synthesis has been proven to be a challenge. Ungar's group has also reported discovering several other brain peptides that can evidently transfer learning from one animal to another. If these peptides too can be synthesized, it's conceivable that a large number of memories can be manufactured. If it develops that memories can indeed be transferred or manufactured for humans, what would be the implications? Some science writers have envisioned injections replacing grammar school textbooks. That seems unlikely based on present knowledge. The implanting of memories in humans, if it comes, will more likely involve situations than facts. It will be more likely to be perfected for purposes of indoctrination rather than education. McConnell believes that synthetic molecules could be manufactured that would make people want to help each other. On the other hand, dictators might be more attracted to the possibility of supplying subjects with synthetic molecules that would make them fearful at the sound of a certain voice or when performing a disproved act. Dictators might very well wish to invest heavily in the techniques. Also, they might be in their indoctrination, which to obliterate in the populist memories of popular democratic leaders or what it had been like to enjoy liberty. Erasing memories and impeding learning. A number of drugs, including antibiotic puromycin, have in animal tests prevented memory storage of very recently learned experiences. Why this happens is still in dispute, but it happens. Electrical stimulation of the amygdala also disrupts the memory storage process, as does electroconvulsion shock. If it develops a memory of events covering recently can surely be wiped out in humans, a lot of people would be interested. Gangsters would no longer need to bump off witnesses to their crimes. Just give them a memory blotting treatment. It would be useless to torture couriers for national intelligence agencies who were known to have delivered secret memorized information. Memory of the messages would be wiped out immediately upon delivery. A great boon for the mentally ill would come if medical research delivered chemical ways of wiping out memories of terrible events that still haunt them. But this would be more difficult since such memories are long fixed. As for impeding learning from occurring in the first place, we are discovering that this is all too easy. One procedure is to continue the present global nutrition pattern whereby millions of infants are severely unnourished before or after birth. In Huxley's Brave New World, menial labors for the future were created before birth and at the state people hatcheries. As noted, these laborers to be had their ration of oxygen cut while they were still fetuses. Semi-morons were guaranteed. Cutting back on protein would probably be just as effective. For young and old alike, the ability to learn could probably be impeded, at least for a while, by adding a bit of calcium to the brain fluid. It could also be inhibited by drugs that slow down the synthesis of RNA and proteins in the brain. In general, our society applauds brain power. The more the better. Many educators, for example, are eager to get going on the use of drugs to enhance learning. Educational journals, as indicated, have discussed the possibilities for use of these drugs in school. Since public schools are mandatory governmental institutions, the public can reasonably expect that any drugs will be introduced with parental consent. Psychoneurobiologists take heed. Techniques for improving memory may turn out to be a boon to long-living people who become senile. They may remember again how to play bridge and dial the telephone. Efforts to improve intelligence at early age by enriching the environment certainly should be encouraged worldwide. This may help reverse the trend of the early 1970s to downgrade the family to assume that just anybody can be hired to take care of a small child. Crick assumes there will be a great rush to obtain Get Smart drugs. They could become the basis of a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the drug companies know it. But who will decide who gets what? Will their distribution be left, as that of most drugs is, to private enterprise? Will they be pushed to public through TV advertisements? And will they be promoted to doctors through the thousands of detail salesmen of the drug companies? Will the supply and demand mechanism set the price? If so, we might end up with $2 pills. Parents will presumably be willing to pay more enormous premium to obtain these wonder drugs for their children, with those who can't afford the drugs suffering social damage as they see their children outdistanced by classmates whose parents are more affluent. Crick suggests another possible scenario. Evidence indicates that drugs would help significantly only with duller pupils. In that case, we would end up with a society where there is little spread in the educatability. If so, he asked, would become the hewers of wood and drawers of water? Still, a third scenario, he says, might develop from the fact that there probably will be drugs that will selectively strengthen clusters of special abilities. Examples might be mathematic skills, verbal skills, and artistic skills. In that case, who would decide how the talent pills would be allocated? Again, would it be decided by huckstering? Or by the decisions of parents or pediatricians, or school boards, or national manpower resources boards? Crick thinks that a federal commission would be required to decide whether the drugs should be utilized at all, and if so, how. Another thought. A younger generation may be learned by chemicals might show condescension towards parents and teachers who were endowed only with minds they built themselves. McGaw advises me that he too has reservations specifically about memory enhancers. They could be one of the great benefit to people with serious memory difficulties. But the abusers, he says, would be the rest of us, and therein lies the problem. We would all like to be able to remember better. I'm not sure that it would be good for us if we could. Do we all wish to be like Mr. S's and Luria's, the mind of a mnemonist, Memonist, memonist, the mind of a mnemonist? A.R. Luria, a Russian psychologist, studied S, a stage entertainer who could perform astounding feats of memory. Off stage, S seemed quite a dull, disorganized fellow. Since he couldn't forget, he had trouble thinking coherently, apparently because of the clutter of the details in his memory. McGaw adds, My own view is that forgetting is beneficial. It is only because we forget details that we can deal in the abstract. And only by forgetting can we ease the pain of old humiliations, shocks, grudges, and defeats. A person can be high in learning ability and memory and still remain a fool. The two do not add up to either brilliance or wisdom in thinking until someone comes along with a pill for wisdom. We might better aspire to become a more humane society than a more brainy one. Chapter 8: Keeping track of and controlling the populace. Those who seek and hold power have found that technology can be a valuable ally. Stephen L. Corover, physiological psychologist. It was the worst quarter century in American history if we judged the 1950 to 1975 period on the basis of increases in efforts to control our lives as private citizens and increases in the capacity to achieve such control. Right to privacy was under assault. Partly, it was the billions of dollars spent by United States security and law enforcement agencies to develop more ingenious techniques for surveillance or espionage. Partly, it was the surveillance capacity of micro miniature devices coming out of the space exploration programs. Partly, it was the emergence of the age of the computer. Partly, it was the obsessive concern with identifying and watching radicals. Partly it was the growing anonymity of life and the curiosity of employers, welfare inspectors, insurers, and credit agencies about our private lives. Partly it was the ambitions of politicians and police to develop better controls over millions of unruly or disenchanted citizens. At any rate, it was a period when scientific techniques for controlling the individual proliferated. They proliferated in the name of efficiency, order, security. The techniques continue to proliferate. They add to the pressures to create a more manipulatable society. Back in 1967, Daedalus devoted an issue to forecasts for the year 2000. Its forecaster was Problems on Privacy. Harry Calvin Jr. stated, by 2000, man's technical inventiveness may have turned the whole community into the equivalent of an army barracks. From today's perspective, that sounds fairly conservative. Samuel Dash, who served as chief counsel to the Senate committee investigating Watergate, has said of late years of the Nixon presidency, we almost had a police state. President Nixon, in the glow of his triumphant re-election in 1972, told an interviewer in a fatherly manner that in some ways the American people were like children. So how are we treating children? The city of Providence, Rhode Island in 1975 almost launched a program to fingerprint its school-aged children. And the idea of making broad use of the technology of fingerprinting was not reserved for Providence children. The director of the Passport Division of the State Department urged that all Americans be fingerprinted. The prints would be put on a government identity card, which every citizen would be required to carry. This would protect us from criminal impersonation, detect crime, and guarantee each citizen a personal identity. A bill was pressed in Congress to require the fingerprinting of everyone. Some of the additional benefits mentioned were that universal fingerprinting might help identify amnesia victims and missing persons. Here is a look at some of the programs for employing scientifically ingenuity to keep track of or control people. Transmitters on humans. What a simple modern idea. Attach tiny automatic radio transmitters to the bodies of people you want to keep track of. The transmitters would be locked onto the wrist, ankle, waist, or be implanted in the body. Each would send a unique signal, and it would be a felony to remove them. Wild? AD 2500 stuff? Not really. The technology has been pretty well developed, and many sober-minded people have been discussing it. A criminologist at the University State University spoke of it to a interested Congress of the American Correctional Association. A journal of the Institute of Electric and Electronic Engineers devoted 21 pages to exploring the possibilities. The American Psychologist carried on an article pondering its implications. Issues in Criminology also had an extensive presentation on the use of electronics to guide the rehabilitation of ex-prisoners and to keep track of them. Or consider two people closely identified with the idea. Ralph K. Schwitzgebel, for years a Harvard psychologist, calls himself a social gadgeteer. He spent 2 years with a team of experts designed possible people monitoring systems. J. A. Meyer has gone furthest in exploring the possibility of locking transponders on people. In the IEE journal mentioned above. A transponder is a device that automatically transmits electrical signals when activated by a specific signal from an interrogator. Meyer is a computer specialist and has been working for the ultra secret U.S. National Security Agency. It is a reasonable guess that he knows what is possible. Who would be asked or ordered to wear these tracking devices? Those most frequently nominated would be parolees. Want an early parole? Just clamp on this little gadget so that we can keep track of your movements. Or do you want any parole at all? No tracking device, no parole. The purpose would be benign. Schwitzgebel calls it an electronic rehabilitation system. Myers calls it an externalized conscious, an electronic substitute for the social conditioning, the group pressure and inner motivation which most of the society lives with. If a robbery occurred, everyone spotted in the general neighborhood of the robbery by transmitter signal would be picked up for questioning. Other uses would include tagging people on probation and tagging juvenile delinquents. Schwitzgebel includes a possibility suicide-prone people and released mental patients. Meyer has broader ideas. He talks of including bailees. People on bail often haven't even been indicted for anything. He also talks of arrestees. An arrestee might be anyone hauled in for speeding or punching someone in the nose, or it might include the tens of thousands of young people arrested for conducting unruly demonstrations. Further, Meyer tossed in as possible certain types of people with criminal records who live in the past have shown a tendency to violence. They might be pulled in and have transponders locked on them and on a retroactive basis. When Meyer adds up all his nominees, he comes up with a figure of 25 million people in the United States alone. By a turn of logic that eludes this writer, he calls all potential subscribers. The taxpayer shouldn't worry. Each subscriber would pay the cost of bearing a transponder on his body, say $5 a week. But Mr. Meyer is a gradualist. He would not try to put transponders on 25 million people right off the bat. At the outset, law enforcement agencies should be allowed to attach or implant only a few million transponders. That apparently is not facing the challenge of eliminating inappropriate behavior head on, but it is a start. There have been proposals that transponders be attached to the bodies of aliens and members of political subgroups. Subgroups presumably are composed of people who are not in the mainstream of American way of life. If the system gets going and we later come under authoritarian rule, it would be quite logical to expand the system to include known dissenters. As a taxpayer, I'm concerned, even if dissenters aren't included. I can see enormously swollen budgets if the police are called upon to monitor the random hourly movements of millions of people. Meyer, however, is reassuring. The system he envisions would practically eliminate the need for prisons and jails. He does acknowledge that criminals also try to beat the system, but the system he visualizes would be so close to foolproof that he feels this problem of tampering is something that could be handled. The simple electronic tagging of people is only one application of people monitoring that has been proposed. Astronauts out in space were constantly monitored for such things as pulse and blood pressure. Why not perform such monitoring here on Earth? A former sex offender could be picked up if sensor triggered a radio signal indicating that he was undergoing penile erection in an inappropriate place. The technology for such signaling is not formidable. Or if the subscriber is fitted with a transceiver, his behavior not only can be monitored but controlled. A transceiver is a radio that both transmits and receives signals. Barton L. Ingram and Gerald W. Smith, writing in Issues of Criminology, offer an example of how this would work. A parolee with a past record of burglaries is tracked to a downtown shopping district, and the psychological data revealed an increased respiration rate, a tension in the musculature, and increased flow of adrenaline. It would be a safe guess, certainly, that he was up to no good. The computer, in this case, weighing the probabilities, would come to the decision and alert the police or parole officer so that they could hasten to the scene, or if the subject were equipped with a radio telemeter, it could transmit an electric signal which could block further action by a subject, causing him to forget or abandon the project. Ingram and Smith also proposed that the electronic devices could be implanted right in the brains of certain parolees. A computer could send out an electrical zap to those who appeared to be about to misbehave. Electrical zaps delivered in or outside the brain also might well have the mind of the former sex offender off whatever had inspired. In J.A. Meyer's bold exploration of the technically feasible, he proposed a network of alarm posts. These would warn of the approach of any person required to wear a transmitter of some sort. Owners of banks, stores, or other buildings would be encouraged to buy radio receivers that would spot the transmitter wearers. These receivers would sound the alarm to warn security personnel of suspicious persons' approach. Imagine 5 million Americans setting off an alarm every time they tried to buy back a pack of cigarettes or cash a check. This thought also occurred to Meyer. He asserts that no one should be stigmatized unreasonably. Only the transmitters of ex-cons who might be a public danger would set off the kind of loud alarm that might stigmatize the person. For the run-of-the-mill transmitter where the store's surveillance would still operate, but would not make the person's presence promiscuously known. Maybe a security officer would hear a quiet psst. Even if transmitters wearer's presence was not promiscuously known, the person might well have traveled paying by check or opening a charge account. Schwitzgebel is quick to acknowledge that electronic rehabilitation systems raise questions of civil liberties that cause concern, but he is quoted as believing that electronic and tracking devices would not seem to be directly prohibited by the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the United States Constitution within a broad view of the issue. It all sounds pretty unusual to me. Meyer does note that such tracking system could be misused. One misuse, he suggests, would be to arrest a person on a flimsy charge, put a transmitter on him, then stall the case in court. This would in effect, keep the person under total surveillance while the authorities were trying to build a case against him. Another misuse that occurred to Meyer would be arresting and bellying of rioters or demonstrators as a mean of intimidation. He even suggests that such a system as he envisioned could lead to a police state, and so should never be developed at all. But he seems to dismiss this when he states the same could be said about police, jails, courts, laws, taxes, and so on. Effective checks and balances will keep things in hand without allowing a monstrosity to grow. I doubt it. The big I. Americans like to think of themselves as open-hearted, freedom-loving. In a number of their towns, the first thing that happens to a newcomer is that his picture is taken surreptitiously. It is taken with a long-range camera. The film is filed at the police station, or it may be sent away to be checked against some master file of unknown troublemakers. In many towns and cities, not only newcomers, but all people who stroll into the central area are photographed by motion picture cameras. Some cameras can zoom and pan and take a close-up picture of a person hundreds of yards away. Mount Vernon, New York, installed two TV cameras at each end of its main downtown street. Hoboken, New Jersey, has TV cameras going in several public areas. So does San Francisco. The New York City Police Department has many TV cameras going. One installation is on Times Square. A small city in upstate New York had for some time more than 20 TV cameras on poles photographing its entire downtown area. Initially, photographing people in public places was done to identify anti-war or civil rights demonstrators. Today, it is done more and more at times with publicity to try to deter street crime. Technology has permitted a great leap forward in visual surveillance. Even in George Orwell's 1984, citizens were safe from omnipresent telescreen eye if they were seen in darkened areas of their homes. Today's police have infrared light cameras that can take fairly good pictures in the dark. Their surveilling TV cameras have been going higher into the sky to cover a broader area of town. First, the cameras were put on top of tall buildings in the University Circle area of Cleveland, heavily populated with collegians. Cameras placed on two buildings during a period of student unrest were able to zoom in on anyone walking within an area of 2 square miles. New York City has at times installed TV cameras and hovering helicopters. Now, with the once incredible expertise achieved by cameras on satellites, U.S. companies have been developing sky cameras for all-purpose surveillance. At least one of the cameras can hover in a stationary position without benefits of cables. It is also considered feasible through micro-miniaturization to position an invisible sky-colored ball the size of a softball a couple hundred feet up in the air. It could both watch and listen to people below. Of special interest to police photographers, often disguised as newspaper or television cameramen, are protest meetings, rallies, lectures, sit-ins, and the like. The Civil Disobedience Unit of the Philadelphia Police has covered thousands of such functions in the past few years. Policemen often find it more effective to stand in uniform taking pictures or to pretend to take pictures. Here are some kinds of mechanical eyes. Eyes that can read letters inside sealed envelopes. Eyes that can duplicate printouts of a computer in another room by picking up electrical impulses. The big ear. One of the yearnings of all authoritarian leaders is to control the information that reaches the populace. You could put the only available radios or TV sets in public squares, as some countries have done, or in big country with many individual set owners, you can try to jam programs from other countries. But in affluent societies with millions of television sets, the problem is complex. It would help authoritarian regimes greatly to identify any household in which a set is tuned to a program disapproved by the regime. Technologists in telecommunications have now developed the tools for such monitoring. They did it at first for a benign reason, to survey viewing habits, but the tools can easily be used for surveillance. In one approach, a panel truck equipped with a radar-like device roams the streets. The device identifies the TV channels being watched in each house. Apartments are harder to unscramble. The device has been demonstrated at conventions and used in several states in this country. A second possibility will become as two-way cable television becomes widespread, and it will undoubtedly become so because it offers so many attractions to viewers and marketers. In times of unrest, any authoritarian regime quite probably would arrange for viewing habits of each subscriber to be recorded in the data bank. As for listening to conversations, I was told by an official in research at the Department of Defense that to pick up conversations within a room no longer requires bugging. Laser beams can be bounced off the window of the room in which the conversation is being held. Or if you see confidential conversations by taking a stroll in a park, don't sit down on a bench. A special gun can fire a spike mic into a nearby tree or bush. Listening and wiretapping has, of course, become a commonplace in many countries. Totalitarian and democratic. In France, a Senate report in a recent estimate that the national government had several thousand taps on telephones on any given day, most of them illegal. In the United States, a great deal of wiretapping, both legal and illegal, is going on. No reliable estimate of wiretapping by the federal government is in the French range. There is, however, a great amount of wiretapping by state and local governments, much of it authorized by court order, and there is considerable amount of private illegal tapping. 20-odd states have authorized tapping by local and state agencies. Since court-authorized wiretaps became legal in 1968, the voices of at least 200,000 Americans have been legally recorded without their knowledge. The problem is that each tap, on average, picks up the voices of about 25 people. Many are using pay telephones that have happened to walk into. Federal court testimony indicates that less than one recorded conversation in 10 is in any way incriminating. Tapping of this kind, then, would seem to be flagrant violation of the Fourth Amendment. The amendment is supposed to protect people against unreasonable search and seizure without evidence of probable cause and some specified criminal activity. The prosecutor in his application for a court order must list the persons he would like to overhear and why. In most cases, he cannot possibly know what people will actually use a public telephone that is to be tapped. Privacy of a great many innocent people is being invaded, and people not named who engage in suspicious conversation are being picked up. Prosecutors have been successful in writing into tap applications a phase others as yet unknown. In 1974, the majority of the newly conservative United States Supreme Court upheld others as yet unknown as acceptable. They said it met the constitutional requirement described particularly, the persons or things to be seized. Speaking for the minority of three, Justice William O. Douglas suggested that his position was preposterous. He said, under today's decision, a wiretap warrant apparently needed specificity, but one name and national dragnet becomes operative. A new technological development that greatly enhances the powers of taps and bugs to incriminate is the voice print. A voice print offers a pattern of lines that comes close to being as precise for individual identification as a fingerprint. Not close enough yet to please the courts, but close. The increase in the use of sophisticated surveillance devices, audio and visual, by both public and private organizations make it imperative that Congress enact a law that regulates strictly when and how the devices may be employed. They are becoming a threat to our free society. The Big Mouth. A fuss developed in the later days of the Nixon administration with the exposure of a proposal to put small government radio into every home in the land. By pushing a button in Washington, these millions of radios could be activated to broadcast administration messages 24 hours a day. The official purpose of this government network would be to improve the nation's disaster alarm system. But the same 300-page secret White House report outlining the proposal talked of using this technology to educate preschool children for world citizenship. Another need cited was to cope more efficiently while growing social unrest. Congressman William Moorhead, a chairman of the House Subcommittee on Information, got his hands on a copy of the report. Every page was stamped administratively confidential. He said it smelled of Big Brotherism. The report had been prepared for John D. Ehrlichman, chairman of the White House Domestic Council. As a close aide of Nixon's, he later became notorious during the Watergate exposures. The report had been prepared by the White House Official Office of Science and Technology, then headed by Edward E. David Jr. Feasibility tests had been conducted. When pressed by Congressman Moorhead, David insisted that the idea of push-button network had already been abandoned on technical grounds. Moorhead contended that it was a shocking document. He saw it as shocking because it gave no consideration for the potential abuses of propaganda, no attention to the possible invasion of privacy. The big memory. This same White House report proposed a wired nation system. It would store information from police and court records and health records in one great computerized memory bank. Apparently, information from the giant computer would flow back and forth between Washington and every corner of the country. The idea of national data bank was not new. I testified before Congress in 1966 to protest a plan very actively being pressed by the U.S. Bureau of the Budget. One gigantic computer would pull all together information on individual Americans held by 20 federal agencies, including the Internal Revenue Service, the Social Security Administration, and the Census Bureau. All three are supposed to treat information on individuals with strictest confidentiality. The administration proponents argued that they wanted the information from such a central data bank only to develop statistics as an aid to planning, but they needed to keep individual identification on the data for updating and cost reasons. They could offer no convincing assurance that the bank would not be misused. The problem of safeguards against misuse, they acknowledged, was as baffling as one. And it apparently had not occurred to them that under an authoritarian regime, such a system could become a giant dossier bank on every citizen. The pooled information could contain every citizen's income, dependents, military service, employment records. Over the years, and many other private matters, the bank would become hazardous as more agencies were added. There was talk of assuring against abuse by setting up the proper administrative guidelines, but guidelines could be quietly changed by an authoritarian administration. Only a federal law setting forth privacy protections and requiring removal of individual identification could offer any hope at all the system would not be misused. Otherwise, it could be used ultimately to intimidate or discredit critics of an administration. At this, writing a single government data center linking federal agencies is still being pushed. One recent name for it was FedNet. Beautiful. Now, its main sponsor is the General Services Administration. When FedNet ran into resistance, there were reports of the GSA would just go ahead and without any specific authorization began routinely pulling government computer data. The idea was that it would be viewed as simply as an improvement of the existing information exchange systems in the government. The federal government has at least 5,000 computer installations for keeping records, and there are also many hundreds of large rooms full of individual records on old-fashioned file cards. The information still hasn't been programmed into computers. The Senate Judiciary Committee estimated in 1974 that the federal government had 1 billion personnel files. That is 5 times as many files as there are people in the land. Added to that are perhaps another 1 billion of personal files in local, county, and state government agencies. Look at a few of the major federal file keepers. The Department of Defense has at least 16 million life histories. The Civil Service has at least 10 million sizable files on individuals. The Internal Revenue Service has, of course, well over 100 million files. The Social Security Administration has another 100 million or so. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has at least 6.5 million files on U.S. residents, including 600,000 computerized criminal histories. It also has files on more than 100,000 residents that at some time or another have been viewed as communist sympathizers. Recently, while under criticism, it has been cutting back drastically on its political file keeping. Secret Service has computerized files on hundreds of thousands of persons of interest. You can become a person of interest by protesting welfare regulations, by being in demonstration, by making harsh remarks about people in Washington, by insisting on personally seeing high government officials for the purpose of venting grievances. The idea of having a whole system of pooled information on people in one data center is being adopted in numerous U.S. cities and counties. Santa Clara County, California, was a pioneer in computer government. Officials began putting into the central computer practically all official records that were available on one or more than 1 million residents. In went birth records, driver's license data, voter registration, jury status, juvenile delinquency records, welfare records, or any involvement with the sheriff or the district attorney's office or the probation office. People who protested this countrywide data bank were dismissed as dreamers. Access to the data was available through any of about 100 teleprocessing stations. In some cases, specific data could be retrieved only at specific stations. New Haven, Connecticut became International Business Machines testing ground for programming everybody within a city. In went all the city's people's files. More recently, federal funding has been available for computerizing records on people and cities under a program labeled Integrated Municipal Information Systems. The acknowledged aim is to help cities create common computerized information file data that can be accessed by all departments of city government. In this program, Long Beach, California, and Wichita Falls, Texas have been early plungers. Charlotte, North Carolina has also moved towards the total system approach. As for states, Minnesota has been a pioneer. It's trying to pull together everything it can about people from files in about 3,500 governmental jurisdictions. At a 1975 conference in Washington, the state official in charge of this ambitious project, Daniel McGraw, proclaimed, "We have everything about people you can think of, and it is in those state files." He was fascinated by the challenge. Minnesota patterned its system after the virtually universal data collection on individuals in Sweden. But recently, Sweden has passed a law designed to protect the more important areas where personnel privacy is involved. Too many people were getting hurt. Some states in this country have disquieting special files. Maryland has been keeping a record of all people receiving psychiatric aid. With federal funding, Washington, D.C. has been asking applicants for driver's license a lot of highly personal questions about their lifestyle on a questionnaire. The subjects of the questions range from marital and money problems to feelings of frustrations on the job, to a sense of loneliness or guilt, and even to night sweats. The questions touch on social variables that add up to a pattern suggesting that the applicant could be a problem drinker. So far, the questionnaires have been voluntary, and information on individuals is not made public. But consider the prospects if the questionnaire becomes required, institutionalized, and computerized in Washington and in various states. It is easy to see how additional stigmatizing information on citizens could find its way into central computer bank. One hazard of the big memory banks is their image of infallibility. How do you argue with a vast computer that pours out derogatory information about you? The truth is that computers are more fallible than old-fashioned record-keeping systems. Most are ill-equipped to correct errors or to bring records up to date. Tens of millions of Americans are on record as having been arrested at some time during their lives, and this doesn't include traffic arrests. Local police and local courts are notoriously careless about doing the paperwork needed to bring arrest records up to date. Many neglect to note dismissed or innocent or acquitted or conviction reversed on appeal. Yet most states send a record of all people arrested to the National Crime Information Center in Washington. This is the central exchange managed by the FBI. Thousands of retrieval centers around the nation can query the Center for Information. Included are not only law enforcement agencies, but employers, credit agencies, insurance companies, licensing agencies. One estimate is more than half the center's records are incomplete as to disposition of cases. In 1975, Massachusetts refused to forward its crime information files to the National Center. State officials knew that their records were grossly incomplete for full of inaccuracies. In 1975, also, the FBI's plan to expand vastly in its own role in computerizing the records fed into the Crime Information Center by the state brought a sharp protest from its own sister agency. Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEAA, said that the plan might lead to federal control of the nation's police and could be perverted into a Big Brother type of arrangement. And even after there has been a conviction on the minor charge, should a person be haunted by all this petty youthful offense? Computers tend to petrify embarrassing information from an earlier era. The hazard of an unforgetting, unrelenting computer was anticipated a century ago by Lewis Carroll in Through the Looking Glass. The horror of that moment, the king went on, I shall never, never forget. You will, though, the queen says, if you don't make a memorandum of it. The mere fact that the open-ended accretion of data on a person is done in a way that is beyond his control can clearly become a major threat to privacy. In April 1975, the National Bureau of Standards, which sets standards for the handling of computer data in the federal government, sponsored a symposium workshop on the privacy mandate. One speaker was Ari Neer, president of the American Civil Liberties Union. He cited case by case unwarranted damage or serious infringement of privacy that has occurred as a result of cumulative information maintained in school system records, juvenile court records, armed service records, arrest records, medical records, mental hospital records. Explosion of data collection on individuals, he said gloomingly, has reached the point where it is difficult for us to even begin to establish any kind of control over our privacy. Data collection, I think, is at odds with the very idea of individual rights. The person whom somewhere somehow gets a troublemaker label on him, he said, doesn't have much choice but to exist on the margins of our society. The hazard is multiplied when information on individuals is collected for one purpose, turns up being used for some other purpose. This inevitably happens when you get a pooling of data from many agencies with multi-access terminals. Information you give on your marital problems when you apply for a federal loan to buy a house could turn up years later in a central data bank and be used against you as a civil service if you apply for a job. Beginnings are being made to try to keep the memory bank from becoming a tyrant. Thanks to congressional action, by 1975, citizens were given to the right to see all the information that certain federal agencies had about them. They were also given the right to demand correction of inaccurate information. Unwarranted large exceptions were made for law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and the law relates only to federal government records. New federal laws have also given citizens the right to see and correct credit bureau information, and parents of children now have the right to see records kept on their children in public schools. These are modest starts. The problem is grave. We are seeing a prime example of technology getting close to being beyond probable human control, except by the controllers. A judge of the State Court of Appeals in Cleveland, J.G. Day, states, of all the great issues on the social agenda for the next 30 years, energy, peace, poverty, conservation, food, whatever, the protection of privacy is one of the most important. Our success in protecting privacy may be the difference between a government that is bearable and one that is just not worth having. Given the peril of that magnitude, it seems reasonable that Americans move to add an Information Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. There should certainly be developed a comprehensive code of fair information practices for all kinds of local, state, and federal agencies. It should set rules for personal automated data collection in a way that afford the citizen reasonable privacy and rights to redress. And there should be established a national privacy board to enforce the code. It should have independence and broad enforcement powers. Such a board should, I believe, be particularly alert to 5 problems. 1. Government information on private citizens should be safeguarded from anyone who does not have a reasonable need to know. 2. There should be public disclosure annually of all personnel data systems maintained either by government or private interstate data collection agencies. Clear, easy procedures should be set up whereby citizens can review and correct data about themselves unless an individual is subject of an active criminal investigation. 3. There should be a prohibition against commingling personnel data collected for different purposes by different government agencies. 4. Obsolete personnel data should be destroyed. Since bureaucrats are virtually incapable of considering anything they have collected as obsolete, procedures should be spelled out. In general, a review every 5 years would be reasonable. For arrest records, there should be a review every 3 years when first arrests are involved. There should be a clear prohibition on organized collection by government agencies of any personnel data unless there is an established need to know and a fairness in knowing. Tags for life. There is now a movement to establish universal identifiers for all Americans. The advent of memory banks has inspired pressure by bureaucratic types to tag every American with a number. Such a universal identifier would provide the crucial link for developing central memory banks. It would enable the pooling of all sorts of information from all sorts of sources, information that could be filed in a central memory bank under the universal identifier. And the bank could function literally from the cradle to the grave. Some have suggesting tattooing the universal identifier on each newborn baby's instep, but that is not really necessary. Several congressmen sought in the mid 1970s to pass a law requiring that all school children be assigned a universal identifier. The identifier proposed was a social security number, even though children obviously were not employed. The American Civil Liberties Union helped defeat the move, but there are many others. When the Social Security number was devised 4 decades ago, there was a great concern in the land. There was fear that the number might become sort of cradle to grave number tied to you. Congressmen voiced these fears. The public finally received assurance that each citizen's number would be kept a closely guarded secret. That secrecy began eroding within a few years as people were routinely asked to give their Social Security numbers when they changed jobs. The confidentiality really began crumbling with the advent of computers. The Internal Revenue Service got permission to ask each citizen to list his Social Security number on his form, and with computers, that number became the crucial key to keeping track of everyone's source of income. All parties who paid any taxpayer income last year were required to report the annual payment, and in reporting, use the taxpayer's Social Security number. Reports on individual coming in front of variety sources all carried the same number. The IRS could have set up its own numbering system and have notified each taxpayer to use that number. Each taxpayer would have been directed to give the number to employers paying him income, the bank to banks paying him interest, and so on. There was apprehension about that taxpayers might react badly. How would they take notification that a brand new number had been created to keep track of all payments made to them? Unfortunately, I believe the IRS chose an easier route. It got the necessary permission from Congress to start using Social Security numbers. There was a problem. Millions of taxpayers didn't have a Social Security number. The Social Security Administration obligingly invented millions of new numbers for these taxpayers. Suddenly, the Social Security number was becoming a universal identifier, a possible link between memory bank systems. Armed forces began using it instead of a service number in 1967. Here are some examples of how confidential the Social Security number has now become. The Retail Credit Company, which has files on financial conditions of tens of millions of Americans, uses it. The United States Civil Service uses it. Massachusetts, to name one state, uses it on applications for driver's license. The Bureau of Census uses it. The Federal Housing Administration uses it for loan applications. Virginia, one of the states that requires it for voter registration. Some states require that it be listed by all people applying for welfare and social services programs. The Medical Information Bureau, which maintains files on medical condition of at least 12 million citizens for the benefit of some 700 insurance companies, uses it. This last use is particularly interesting. The Bureau assembles information on the health of millions of Americans who are seeking health or life insurance. It manages to do this by assembling information on the examinations given applicants for life insurance, or it assembles the information from claims or insurance benefits. Other data derives from information from insurance companies obtained from healthcare providers such as doctors and hospitals. The Bureau's headquarters is in Greenwich, Connecticut, but if a person wishes to check what information the Bureau has on health, he must write to a post box office in Boston. At this writing, Box 105, Essex Station, he will eventually be requested to fill out a 2-page application. Then he would either come in person to Boston to obtain the information or accept a collect phone call. The Bureau has seemed reluctant to put anything in writing, and he must waive all claims for liability against any misinformation the files may have about him. In many instances, he can apparently get the information only by having it explained to him by his physician. But back to the universal identifier. Before World War II, Holland had a superb identification system, one that included every citizen. On the other hand, France had been relatively indifferent to keeping records on its citizens. When the Nazis' armies invaded Holland, they seized the files and systematically tracked down the Jews of Holland. The records reportedly led them to arrest the father of Anne Frank, the girl who wrote the harrowing diary. In France, the Nazis had a terrible time trying to find who was who. We have reached the point where memory banks obviously are here to stay. There is probably no turning back, but a universal identifier that can provide linkage between different systems is dangerous and unnecessary. A system identifier is perfectly adequate. The IRS could have developed its own unique system, and the armed forces could have stayed with their perfectly adequate service numbers. And it is the bureaucratic passion for consolidating the system so that information on individuals can be swapped and pooled that is ominous. Such centralizing requires the universal identifier. The omnipotent potential of a universal identifier was anticipated by W.H. Auden even before memory banks were developed. In 1940, when governments were beginning in earnest to put numbers on people, he wrote a poem called The Unknown Citizen to JS 07M 378. This marble monument is erected by the state. Auden's unknown citizen was curiosity because the government had no record of any complaints whatever involving him. The poem ended. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should certainly have heard. The move to the universal identifier was slowed slightly at the federal level by the Privacy Act of 1974. It placed restrictions on further expansion of unapproved use of the Social Security number by other agencies. But there is no longer anything special about the Social Security number. What is needed is a flat nationwide prohibition against the establishment of any kind of universal identifier. Let each organization, private or governmental, develop its own people numbering system. The Veterans Secret Label. In 1956, the U.S. military began putting separation program numbers, or SPNs, on all military discharge papers, honorable or otherwise. The numbers were for the official use only area. Hardly noticeable. Many of these 530 spin code numbers were character ratings of the person discharged. Some covered undesirable habits or attitudes that some superiors had reported. Remember, many of these citizens being labeled for life had been draftees ranging in mood from unenthusiastic to resentful. Close to 1 million honorably discharged veterans were given discharge papers with the SPIN code numbers that were derogatory, or partly so. SPIN number 368 meant that the veteran had been labeled as having an antisocial personality. The number 265 stigmatized him by alleging that he had a character disorder. Number 263 indicated that he had been reported for bedwetting, perhaps under hostile fire. Number 41A charged him with the lack of interest. Number 469 it labeled him unsuitable. In 1973, more than 35,000 discharged veterans unknowingly carried this unsuitable label in their pockets as they headed back into civilian life, even though they had been given an honorable discharge. In modern America, a recently discharged veteran seeking a job usually has had to show his discharge papers to personnel officers of the employing organization. The translation on these innocuous SPN numbers gradually was bootlegged to many major corporate employers such as Firestone, Boeing, Chrysler, and Standard Oil of California. After 17 years of the American Civil Liberties Union discovered and brought to public attention the meaning of SPN. It also brought suit, and within a year, 1974, the Pentagon ordered an end to SPIN labeling. Veterans were given the right to stand in line to get a new discharge paper without a SPIN number, but there are still thousands of veterans holding a discharge papers who are unaware of the stigma that may be in them. And the Pentagon still has deep in its vast files the SPN numbers of every veteran discharged from 1956 through 1973. For most of the veterans, Social Security number is listed. If a comprehensive FedNet memory bank ever gets humming, these records might become a part of it. A decent thing to do, I believe, would be to issue a new SPIN-less discharge papers to all veterans holding SPIN-coded papers. The cost would be far less than building a single modern bomber plane. And the derogatory Pentagon SPN listings on all honorably discharged personnel should be destroyed. Levers of mass intimidation. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, observant people in the land of the free got a fair idea of how their society might slide into semi-police state. The national mood was ugly. The White House, for most of the time, was dominated by people more preoccupied with mastering technologies of people control than with preserving citizens' rights. The most common characteristic of all police states is intimidation by surveillance. Citizens know they are being watched and overheard. Their mail is being examined. Their homes can be invaded. Richard Nixon, a president, was an ardent listener and intimidator. He wiretapped reporters, officials, his own brother. A former Nixon speechwriter, the columnist William Safire, wrote in 1974 that willingness to listen in was second nature to Richard Nixon. Safire had reluctantly concluded that Nixon had an addiction to eavesdropping. Only the bungled efforts to wiretap the headquarters of opposition triggered the course of revelations that eventually brought his downfall. Long before then, in 1970, he personally approved the so-called Huston Plan for political surveillance. It involves such methods as burglary wiretapping, maintaining mail covers, and bugging. His plan purportedly was aborted, but soon after, the White House had its own personal secret agents who were using many of these methods. Surveillance of critics and dissidents, as well as conceivable communist sympathizers, was of course not new, but in this period, it reached a new high. Thanks to new surveillance technologies, for example, the U.S. National Security Agency heard virtually every overseas telephone call during the 6 years ending in 1973. It also inspected virtually every cable. Central Intelligence Agency personnel stationed in the United States opened more than 200,000 letters illegally. And the FBI had mail opening projects in 8 states. A research organization, the Center for National Security Studies, estimated in late 1975 that more than 200,000 Americans had been subjects of active surveillance in recent years. I believe that as a general rule, government agencies, whether federal, state, or local, should be barred by federal law from collecting and filing any data about citizens' political activity, association, or expression beyond voter registration. That is what the First Amendment is largely about. The only exception should be when a person is being considered for appointment to high national office or when there is a probable cause confirmed by court order that an individual has recently engaged in violence against other persons or may be engaged in espionage, sabotage, treason, or terrorist activities. A few more words about strategies of intimidation used by the Nixon White House. Nixon people tried to punish a Newsday reporter. The reporter had written a critical series on Mr. Nixon's good friend, B.B. Rebozo, who was deeply involved in the Watergate scandal. A White House official requested that the reporter be subjected to an income tax audit. Also, there was a memorandum proposing antitrust actions against critical news media. The newer technologies of broadcasting news are more vulnerable to intimidation than printed media. They need to have their federal licenses renewed in order to function. In 1970, Mr. Nixon set up in the White House the Office of Telecommunications Policy. Among other things, it began monitoring radio and television coverage of news involving the administration. According to one memo uncovered by the Watergate investigation, White House aides Charles W. Colson had a meeting with the top executives of all three national networks. Colson reported, apparently triumphantly, to H.R. Haldeman, Mr. Nixon's chief aide, about how nervous the executives had been. They had been vastly impressed, he said, to discover how thoroughly their news programs were being monitored and analyzed. In short, they are very much afraid of us and are trying hard to prove they are good guys. But apparently they are not afraid enough to please the White House. By 1972, the head of Office of Telecommunications Policy, Clay T. Whitehead, gave a speech that some viewed as ominous. In citing it, Republicans Senator Lowell P. Weicker Jr. of the Watergate Select Committee interpreted it as a threat to owners of individual television stations. The threat seen was that individual stations might lose their licenses if they did not shape up by bringing pressure to force their networks to correct imbalance or consistent bias. This power to punish through licensing reportedly came up in a taped conversation Mr. Nixon had with his counsel, John W. Dean III, in September 1972. Mr. Nixon was angry that Watergate revelations were being published by the Washington Post. He was quoted as vowing vengeance and commenting, "They have a television station, you know." Within a few weeks, two groups with close political ties to Mr. Nixon challenged the Post's television license in Jacksonville and Miami, Florida. Another possible lever of control that seemed to fascinate many of the Nixon group was the Internal Revenue Service. Its memory banks contained year by year accumulations of data on people's financial affairs. This fact was seen as an ideal tool for intimidating or discrediting enemies or dissidents or political opponents. In 1969, under prodding by the Nixon White House, the Internal Revenue Service set up a special staff to watch activist or leftist organizations. The staff compiled dossiers on 8,585 individuals and 2,873 organizations, according to records brought to light by the Tax Reform Research Group. Caught up in this dragnet were such solidly American organizations as National Council of Churches, the Urban League, and Americans for Democratic Action. A great deal of information unrelated to tax status was assembled and in some cases was passed on to law enforcement agencies. During the Watergate hearings, John Dean testified that several lists of people considered by the White House to be its enemies were drawn up. More than 600 names were transmitted to the Internal Revenue Service with the suggestion that their tax returns get a good going over. In 1975, the IRS began an investigation of charges that in the 1971 to 73 period, some of the enemies may indeed have been harassed by the IRS agents who investigated their sex habits. their drinking, and their social habits. As it turned out, the White House was hampered in its campaign to use the IRS. The director, Johnny M. Walters, and many of his subordinates resisted courageously. Walters took seriously his mandate to exercise fairness and to preserve the secrecy of tax returns. He resisted efforts to politicize the IRS. There is little evidence that the IRS unfairly harassed the enemies and the activists it was asked to investigate. At one point, Mr. Nixon's top domestic aide, John Ehrlichman, blasted Walters over the telephone for his foot-dragging tactics in pressing a case of special interest to the White House. According to the Walters testimony, Mr. Walters resigned. Soon thereafter, Mr. Nixon was in such deep trouble because of the Watergate exposures that attempts to use the IRS were discontinued. But taken together, the efforts of the Nixon White House to intimidate and control the people and institutions it viewed as opponents will go down as a close brush with authoritarianism. If a night watchman had not happened to notice an odd piece of tape stuck on the lock of a door at the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate, the history of the 1970s would make much more discouraging reading for those who cherish freedom. On the broader theme of this chapter, the new technologies for keeping track of and in controlling the populace, the evidence we have examined seems to reaffirm the validity of a question that was raised by Tom Wicker, the political columnist. Wicker asked, "Can a man preserve his liberty and individuality against his own genius?"